So I'm continuing on with this reading the Sam's monograph, which I don't have the title and author easily available, but it's the same one I was already looking at in the last video. But this is about the relative combat power model from the early 1990s perspective. Now we're getting to the author's, well, a more important part of this paper and the more interesting part. So the issue of a relative combat power model, for me, it's a model at all of combat power at the tactical versus operational levels. But let's see. So the author here, he's talking about the differences. He argues, probably correct. At this time, I'll go with it, yeah. Tactical and operational levels are fundamentally and profoundly different. First, there's the political aspect. There is little to indiscernible political play at the tactical level. But yeah, no, there should be a fairly important political element to the operational level of war. Just think of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And it's easy to see the operational level. Actually, in that war, it's easy to see the tactical levels, operational levels, and strategic levels, and it's easy to see the political dynamics going on at the operational level there. But basically, operational aims and one or more campaign in a war, pretty much we're going to think in terms of what political goals are trying to be achieved. And there's, of course, considering the scales of the tactical level, the operational level, you can assume that there's going to be a more significant morale effect or moral effect of what happens at the operational level on the adversary population and political will and the will of the leadership at the operational versus the tactical level. We also have generally, again, scale and scope. So obviously the operational level can, think about the Pacific Theater in World War II, the operational level can be very, very large in space and time. It's hard to think certainly in some cases, when looking at the operational level of war, it's hard to think in terms of a point of decision. Was the point of decision the entire Wilderness campaign? I'm sorry, the entire Peninsula campaign? No, back up. The Wilderness campaign. And how is winning defined? How does winning look at the two different levels of war? Winning and losing at the tactical level, we should think in terms, again, of it being more obvious, relatively more obvious, and more tangible. Tangible meaning physical, physically discernible, like destroyed tanks, artillery pieces, etc. Also, at the tactical level, the enemy withdrawing, fleeing, routing is something that can be physically sensed and observed. Not always clear. Those things not always clear at the operational level. So, given those, the relationship between, let's see, I guess the winning and losing of the fighting part and the other stuff of battles and campaigns not relating directly to the destruction, the winning and the losing. The relationship between those two is different at the tactical level than the operational level. Meaning, to put it again very simply, at the tactical level, your fighting, your destruction, your winning and losing has a huge relative value and impact, and the stuff of the battle, or smaller engagement, etc. The other things are relatively unimportant. Well, I will not say completely unimportant, but relatively unimportant. At the operational level, it's not that lopsided. In other words, the non-fighting parts of the operational level of war can be relatively important, and conversely, the fighting, the destruction, etc., can be relatively unimportant. Just the relationship is different. Let's see. Back to Field Manual 100-5. At the time that this writer wrote this paper, the latest would have been the 1986 Operations Manual, the second iteration of Air-Land Battle. So the author's quotes from FM 100-5, TAC 86. More about the authors of FM 100-5. Okay. Operational level victory, the dynamics of the modern battlefield. Again, that's interesting to consider a 1990, early 90s perspective. Not surprisingly, contrasting the time of Napoleon to what was then contemporary. Not surprisingly, because a lot of U.S. Army instruction was using that setting and using that teaching approach, I guess. So to talk about the changes, again, specifically the changes in, we're really talking about is the art of war, but also the art and science of war from Napoleon's time to, again, the late Cold War period. So we're talking about vastly increased ranges and lethality and accuracy of modern weapons, the scope and scale of battlefields and operations, and the depths of armies, all dramatically changed from Napoleon's time. Bottom line is, very hard in the contemporary period to get to a point of decision where you can have a battle and you lay a battle on top of a point of decision, and then the outcome of that battle can basically define the outcome of the entire conflict. Interestingly, the author talks about fire effects, concentrating fire effects, massing of fire effects, using the cybernetic term. This is probably something I should be coming back to. Interesting, at this time period in U.S. Army literature, this term cybernetic is not, the prevalence of that term is not by chance. It was being talked about, and I believe it was actually being taught in a schoolhouse setting at this time. So consequently, as U.S. Army students wrote their papers, completed their theses, cybernetic plays in various output of this period. But here, the author's talking about destroying an enemy's essential C3I, command control, communications, and intelligence, can be as decisive as physically defeating forces. And it's not surprisingly that you would have this thinking right about the time of the First Gulf War. Domains of war. This is the second time it comes up. There's another paper from this time period. I believe that paper is 1992 or 3, talking about the domains of war during this time period. I knew it. I mean, I was thinking that it had to have been in the discussions of the time period, but here it is. 3 domains, not the domains at all that we think of today. This is why I'm keying in on this. There it is, physical, moral, and cybernetic. I knew it. That's the exact structure. That's the exact framework that's came out in this other early 90s U.S. Army schoolhouse paper. And yep, there's the teacher. There is a teacher by name. I'll talk about him later separately. Yep, that's him. I recognize the references to other works of his. So he was teaching this, which I like. That's why I'm making such a big deal about this. I like this construct. Physical, moral, and cybernetic. Cybernetic here means not technology, but cybernetic is the domain that covers the interaction of humans and machines and information systems. So it's not we talk about cyberspace today, which I still am not convinced cyberspace is a warfighting domain, even though technically and even though officially it is today. I think that's a mistake. I do not believe cyberspace is a warfighting domain, but cybernetic, I can see the cybernetic domain being a warfighting domain. Again, that's the interaction of humans and machines and data and information systems, communication systems. I'll give that more specific thought later, but in general, cybernetic is the interface of humans and computers. Let's just simplify it. Let's just simplify it and say cybernetic is the interaction of humans and computers, not computers, obviously not humans, because today there's talk about a human domain. I don't believe there's a human domain either, but there's a cybernetic domain. I can see that. So yeah, physical, moral, and cybernetic. So at the time, this is a good short rundown of what the thinking was at this time. Again, when I say that, I mean the thinking that as it was presented by this particular writer and instructor in the Army schoolhouse at this time. So you have let's start with the physical domain is obviously the forces and weapons and their physical effects on the battlefield. That makes perfect sense. Then you have the moral domain. That's the intangibles. This is the will of the commander, the will of the soldier to continue, the will of an army to continue its unit cohesiveness and esprit, unit and individual courage in the face of great challenges, and then the cybernetic domain. Let's see how here. Cybernetic domain is concerned fundamentally with the functions we currently call C3I. So here they do include communications. But here the writer describes it as how an army makes decisions, communicates those decisions, and then ensures that those decisions are understood and executed correctly. All right. All right, that is interesting. So when I need a good description of the 3 domains as they were represented in this time, at this time, in the U.S. Army. This is it. The good commander uses all three domains to get at his opponent. And that's really what it's all about. That's really what the point of even identifying warfighting domains.